The Ressence Type 1 Squared, this watch on my wrist right now, is a pretty distinct watch. It's unlike any other watch that you've probably ever seen. Ressence has a very unique design language. And on paper and in photographs, this watch is pretty extreme. It feels really in your face. The dial goes all the way out to the edges, and that dial layout is pretty wild looking. But what is it actually like to live with a watch like that day to day? All right, so a couple things first. Ressence is an independent brand founded in 2011 based out of Belgium, and their whole MO is deconstructed time telling. That is watches with no hands. Now that might be a little disingenuous because you look at the dial and you see some hands, but what I mean is that those hands don't move independently. The dial moves all in one, and I'll show you what that means in a little bit. Now, as a brand, Ressence has a very cohesive design language between all of their different model references, which they call types. This is the Type 1 Squared. Name comes from the square cushion case. Some are actually filled with oil, and that's meant to eliminate any sort of visual refraction when you're looking through the crystal to the dial. It appears actually printed on the crystal. It seems as if it's a digital watch, but it's actually analog. Now, this is not that. It's a more conventional design type. You know, the watch is filled with air, but even still, the dial feels right up on the crystal. 42 millimeters across, 11.5 millimeters thick, so it's actually quite svelte when it's on the wrist. I mean, look at that from there. Like, it's a really nice wearing watch. Grade 5 titanium. Interesting note, all titanium is titanium depending on the grade, but as you go up in grade number, the alloy is adjusted. More metals are added to the titanium to give it different properties. This is grade 5. It's super highly polished and by the looks of it would appear stainless steel, but when you pick it up, you know this is titanium. It's super lightweight, incredibly comfortable. It almost disappears on the wrist. Spoiler alert. The movement is based on an ETA 2824. Solid, workhorse, reliable movement, 36 hours of power reserve, pretty standard watchmaking, but the way that this comes out in the time telling is totally unconventional. I mentioned earlier that there's not necessarily any hands on the watch, and that's true. You do have indicators in the form of like traditional hands, but they are on the dial themselves. They don't move on their own. What you have are subdials that all rotate and orbit around each other. Ressence calls this the Ressence Orbital Convex System. It's a lot of words to say that there are some subdials and they move around together. And the first thing you'll notice is there is an hour subdial. 1 through 11 with the Ressence hand at 12. Pretty standard, like it's a familiar thing that you'll find. And then off of that is the minute hand. This is where things get interesting. So when you start at 60 with the minute hand and it goes around clockwise from 5, 10, 15, 30, 45, back to 60 in one full revolution, all of these subdials that you see orbit in formation. So the dial is always going to look different no matter what time you look at it. And then separately, you have a day of the week indicator with 5 business days and 2 orange lines for the weekend. It's just a clean, slick design, no crown sticking out the side. It's pretty nice, super flush. So how do you set the time? Well, you flip the watch over and there's a little teacup handle that pops out of the back of the case. And this is how you wind the watch, set the time, and set the day. Flip it out and literally just turn it around and you look over on the dial side, make sure you're doing everything correctly. It's going in the right direction. Get it to your desired time, flip that bad boy back down. And what's great is you would think that would add a whole lot of thickness to the back. It sits flush into the case back, and if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. But you kind of need to know because that's how you set the time. Okay, I'm gonna level with you here. I'm a little late to the game. This watch now is 7 years old. But I've kind of stayed away from this watch, to be honest with you, because it seems so outlandish and so far away from what I'm used to and what fits my style that I never considered it a real possibility as a watch for me. When you look at it, 42 millimeters across is a big watch no matter how you slice it, and this one, it seems like a lot of watch, and that's not untrue. However, when you put the watch on, it doesn't seem like that's actually the case. The titanium, the short lugs, everything all comes together and coalesces to make a watch that disappears more than you might imagine for something that appears to be a giant TV screen on your wrist. So as I've spent some time with the Ressence Type 1 squared, there's a couple things I'm noticing that bump for me a little bit. First and foremost is a pretty noticeable one, the reflections. The dial is right up on the crystal, and that gives a really cool effect and makes it pretty easy to read. However, the reflections are still quite prevalent. You could use this thing as a mirror if you wanted to. It could definitely benefit from an AR coating, but it's a pretty small hurdle to jump over once you get used to reading the watch. They're not that distracting. It's a little thing, but it's pretty noticeable right away. And second, and this is a little bit personal to me, when I'm wearing a watch, I like to interact with it. I don't want to just use my watch to tell the time. I like to turn a bezel, I like to use a chronograph, and that's something I'm missing here, is that mechanical interface. A watch to me is a little bit more of a tool. I want to be able to interact with it a little bit more. I fidget in that way, but this is, again, subjective, may not matter to you quite as much, but it's something that I'm definitely missing with the Type 1. Coming into this, I thought this watch was going to be ostentatious, borderline obnoxious. It's a big watch in many ways. Yeah, 20 grand plus is a lot to spend on a watch, but if you got the money and you want something that is unique and does feel special, this watch definitely ticks those boxes. So where do I stand with the Ressence Type 1 squared? Well, to be honest with you, I'm surprised, but it blends in just the right ways, and every time I put this watch on, it feels special, and that's exactly what you want out of something like a Ressence.